In the medieval period, which historians generally agree spanned from approximately the 5th century to the 15th century, though some scholars debate whether it extended into the early 16th century in certain regions, the folk experience of altered consciousness through various substances was remarkably different from modern understanding. To begin our exploration, we must first establish the context of daily medieval life, which was characterized by agricultural rhythms, religious observance, and social hierarchies that would seem quite foreign to contemporary observers. The typical medieval person, whether they lived in England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, or the various kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, would wake at dawn. This was not because they set an alarm or had particular enthusiasm for early rising, but rather because the sun dictated the rhythm of life. Candles and oil lamps were expensive, you see, and most people simply went to bed when it became dark and arose when light returned. This pattern persisted for centuries, with very little variation in terms of substances that could alter one's state of mind. The medieval period had access to several options, though they were quite different from what one might encounter today. The most common, of course, was alcohol. But let us not rush ahead. First, we should discuss the brewing process in detail. As brewer, understanding the methodology helps us appreciate the experience. Ale, which was different from beer, was brewed in most households. The process began with malted barley. Barley, a grain that grows well in temperate climates, would be soaked in water until it began to sprout. This sprouting process, which typically took several days, converted the starches in the grain into sugars. The sprouted barley, now called malt, would then be dried in a kiln. The temperature of the kiln was important, though medieval brewers did not have thermometers and relied on experience and observation. Once dried, the malt would be ground into a coarse powder using a quern stone, or in larger operations, a water mill. The ground malt would then be mixed with hot water in a large vessel called a mash tun. This mixture would sit for several hours, during which time the remaining starches would convert to sugar, creating a sweet liquid called wort. The wort would be drained off and transferred to a fermentation vessel. At this point in the process, yeast would be added. Though medieval brewers did not understand yeast, we do today. They simply knew that adding the foam or sediment from a previous batch of ale would cause the new batch to ferment. The yeast, which is actually a living microorganism, would consume the sugars in the wort and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide as waste products. This process would take several days to complete. The resulting ale was relatively low in alcohol content, usually between 2 and 3%, which is lower than most modern beers. It would also go sour quite quickly, within a few days, because medieval ale was not boiled with hops, which act as a preservative. Hops were used in beer, which became increasingly popular in the later medieval period, but ale remained the common drink for most people for much of the era we are discussing. People drank ale with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This was not because medieval people were constantly trying to achieve intoxication, but rather because ale was safer to drink than water in many cases. The brewing process involved boiling the water, which killed harmful bacteria, and the alcohol provided additional antiseptic properties. A typical person might consume several pints of ale per day without feeling particularly intoxication, due to its low alcohol content. However, stronger alcoholic beverages were also available. Wine, imported from France, Italy, Spain, and other regions, was consumed by those who could afford it. The process of making wine was similar to brewing ale in that it involved fermentation, but instead of grain, wine was made from grapes. Grapes would be harvested in the autumn, crushed to extract their juice, and the juice would be allowed to ferment in large barrels. The fermentation process for wine was essentially the same as for ale, with yeast converting sugars into alcohol. Wine typically had a higher alcohol content than ale, usually between 8 and 15%, depending on various factors, including the type of grape, the climate where it was grown, and the fermentation process. Red wine was made from red or purple grapes, fermented with their skins, which gave the wine its color and tannins. White wine was made from white grapes or from red grapes, with the skins removed before fermentation. The experience of drinking wine in the medieval period would have been somewhat different from modern wine drinking. Medieval wine was often quite acidic and could be rather harsh to the modern palate. It was sometimes mixed with water, honey, or spices to make it more palatable. Spiced wine, called hypocras, was particularly popular among the wealthy. The recipe for hypocras involved red wine, sugar or honey, and a mixture of spices, including ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and sometimes long pepper or grains of paradise. But let us return to the question of what getting high was like in medieval times. To properly address this question, we need to move beyond alcohol and discuss other substances. Opium, derived from the poppy plant, was known and used in medieval Europe, though it was not as common as it had been in ancient times or would become in later periods. The opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, produces a milky latex in its seed pods. When this latex is collected and dried, it becomes opium. Opium contains several alkaloids, the most notable being morphine, codeine, and the bane. Though medieval people had no knowledge of these specific compounds, they simply knew that opium had powerful effects. It could relieve pain, suppress coughs, and, in larger doses, produce a state of drowsiness and euphoria. However, they also observed that regular use could lead to dependence, and that very large doses could be fatal. In medieval Europe, opium was primarily used as a medicine rather than recreationally. It would be prescribed by physicians for various ailments, including severe pain, insomnia, and dysentery. The opium would typically be dissolved in wine or mixed into a paste or pill. One popular preparation was theriac, also called Venice treacle in England, which was a complex mixture of many ingredients, often including opium, used as a cure-all medicine. The process of taking opium medicinally would have been relatively unremarkable from the perspective of the person taking it. A physician would determine the appropriate dose, which was not a precise science given the variable potencies of opium and the lack of standardized measurements. The patient would consume the opium preparation, usually by mouth, and would then wait for the effects to begin. The onset of opium's effects typically occurred within 30 minutes to an hour of ingestion. The person would first notice a sense of warmth spreading through their body, followed by a feeling of contentment and well-being. Pain, if present, would begin to diminish. The person might feel drowsy and would often fall asleep. Upon waking, they might feel somewhat groggy and constipated, as opium slows the digestive system. However, we should be clear that recreational use of opium was not common in medieval Europe. It was expensive, difficult to obtain, and primarily controlled by physicians and apothecaries. The experience of using opium recreationally, as became more common in later centuries, was not typical of the medieval period we are discussing. Another substance that deserves mention is henbane, a plant in the nightshade family. Henbane, known scientifically as Hyoscyamus niger, grows wild in many parts of Europe and contains tropane alkaloids, including hyoscyamin and scopolamine. These compounds can produce hallucinations, delirium, and a sensation of flying, which is why henbane was associated with witchcraft and witches' flying ointments in medieval and early modern folklore. Henbane was used medicinally for pain relief and as a sedative, but it was dangerous. The line between a therapeutic dose and a toxic dose was very narrow. A person who consumed too much henbane might experience terrifying hallucinations, extreme agitation, seizures, and potentially death. For this reason, it was used cautiously, and only by those with knowledge of its properties. The experience of henbane intoxication, when it occurred, was reportedly quite unpleasant. Historical accounts describe confusion, restlessness, and frightening visions. The person might lose touch with reality and behave irrationally. After the effects wore off, which could take many hours, the person would have little or no memory of what occurred during the intoxication. This amnesia was caused by the scopolamine in the plant, which interferes with the formation of new memories. Mandrake, another plant in the nightshade family, was also known in medieval times. The mandrake root, which sometimes resembles a human figure, was the subject of much folklore and superstition. It was believed to scream when pulled from the ground, killing anyone who heard it. To safely harvest mandrake, according to medieval belief, one should tie a dog to the plant and then call the dog from a safe distance. The dog would pull up the plant and die from the scream, but the human harvester would survive. Of course, mandrake does not actually scream when harvested, but it does contain tropane alkaloids, similar to those in henbane, and it can produce similar effects when consumed. Medieval physicians used mandrake as an anesthetic for surgery and as a treatment for various ailments. Like henbane, it was dangerous, and overdoses could be fatal. The futile use of mandrake as an anesthetic is worth discussing in some detail. Before the development of modern anesthesia, surgery was an excruciating ordeal. Various methods were used to dull the pain or render the patient unconscious. One method involved giving the patient a preparation called a soporific sponge. This was a sponge that had been soaked in a mixture of opium, mandrake, henbane, and other substances, then dried. When surgery was to be performed, the sponge would be moistened with hot water and held under the patient's nose. The patient would breathe in the vapors and hopefully fall unconscious. The effectiveness of this method was variable. Sometimes the patient would indeed lose consciousness and experience less pain during the procedure. Other times the patient would remain awake and alert, gaining no benefit. And occasionally the patient would slip into a coma or die from the treatment. Medieval surgery was, in general, a desperate measure undertaken only when there seemed no other option. Let us now consider cannabis, which was known in medieval Europe, though not widely used. Cannabis, or hemp, was grown primarily for its fibers, which were used to make rope, cloth, and paper. The psychoactive properties of cannabis were known in other parts of the world, particularly in the Middle East and Asia, but were not commonly exploited in medieval Europe. The hemp grown in Europe was generally of varieties that were low in tetrahydrocannabinol, the primary psychoactive compound in cannabis. This was not a deliberate choice but rather a result of the varieties that grew well in European climates and the selection over generations for plants that produced good fiber. The idea of breeding cannabis specifically for high psychoactive content would have been foreign to medieval European hemp farmers. However, there were occasional references to the medicinal or intoxicating use of cannabis in medieval texts. Some herbals mentioned that hemp seed could relieve pain or induce sleep. Whether these references were based on actual observation of effects or were simply repetitions of information from classical sources is unclear. What is clear is that cannabis use, recreational or otherwise, was not a significant part of medieval European culture in the way that alcohol use was. We should also discuss ergot, though it was more of an accidental intoxicant than an intentional one. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. When contaminated grain is ground into flour and baked into bread, the ergot alkaloids survive the baking process and can poison anyone who eats the bread. Ergot poisoning, called ergotism or St. Anthony's fire in the Middle Ages, could take two forms: convulsive and gangrenous. Convulsive ergotism caused hallucinations, seizures, and mental disturbances. People experiencing this form of ergotism might see visions, hear voices, or feel as though insects were crawling on their skin. Gangrenous ergotism caused the blood vessels in the extremities to constrict, cutting off blood flow. Fingers, toes, and sometimes entire limbs would turn black and die, eventually falling off. Both forms were agonizing and often fatal. Ergotism was not an attempt to get high but rather a tragedy that befell communities when their grain supply became contaminated. However, the hallucinogenic effects of ergot are noteworthy in our discussion because they represent one of the more powerful consciousness-altering experiences available in the medieval period, even if it was an unwanted and dangerous one. The experience of ergot hallucinations was reportedly terrifying rather than enjoyable. People would see demons, experience religious visions, or feel as though they were burning alive, hence the name St. Anthony's fire. These experiences sometimes led to mass hysteria or religious movements. Some historians have speculated that ergot poisoning may have played a role in cases of dancing mania, where groups of people would dance uncontrollably for hours or days, though this theory remains controversial. Now we should turn our attention to the social context of intoxication in medieval times. Drinking alcohol was a social activity, often done in groups. Taverns and alehouses were common gathering places where people would drink, eat, gamble, and exchange news and gossip. The atmosphere in a medieval tavern would have been quite different from a modern bar. The pity room would be dimly lit by candles or rushlights. The air would be thick with smoke from pity as the fire and the smell of unwashed bodies, stale ale, and whatever food was being cooked. People would sit on benches at long tables, drinking from wooden or leather cups, or, for the wealthy, glass or metal vessels. Conversation would be loud, as people needed to speak over the general din. Songs might be sung, though not the carefully rehearsed performances one might hear at a concert today, but rather the rough, enthusiastic singing of people who had been drinking. Fights might break out over perceived insults or disagreements, though severe violence was discouraged by the innkeeper who wanted to keep order in his establishment. The experience of getting drunk in a medieval tavern would have progressed much as it does today. After 1 or 2 cups of ale or wine, the person would feel relaxed and cheerful. Their inhibitions would lower slightly, and they might talk more freely or laugh more readily. After several more drinks, they would begin to feel genuinely intoxicated. Their speech would slur, their movements would become uncoordinated, and their judgment would be impaired. If they continued drinking, they might reach the point of severe intoxication, where they would have difficulty standing or speaking coherently. They might become emotional, either maudlin and weepy, or aggressive and belligerent. Eventually they would likely fall asleep, either at the table or in a corner, or they would stumble home if they lived nearby. The next day, they would wake with a hangover, feeling nauseated, headachy, and regretful, much like anyone who drinks too much in any era. However, we should note that the pattern of drinking to severe intoxication was not necessarily more common in medieval times than today. Despite the prevalence of alcohol, most people drank throughout the day, but maintained a level of mild, functional intoxication or no intoxication at all. Thanks to the low alcohol content of common ale, drinking to the point of drunkenness was generally frowned upon by both secular and religious authorities. Though it certainly occurred, the Church's position on intoxication was nuanced. Moderate drinking was acceptable and even encouraged as part of social and religious life. Wine was central to the Christian Eucharist, representing the blood of Christ. However, drunkenness was considered a sin, one of the manifestations of the deadly sin of gluttony. Preachers would warn against the dangers of excessive drinking, which could lead to other sins, including lust, violence, and sloth. Medieval people who drank excessively might be subject to various punishments. In some communities, a drunk person might be placed in the stocks, a wooden frame that locked around their ankles or wrists and neck, forcing them to stand or sit in a public place where they would be mocked and pelted with garbage by passers-by. This public humiliation was meant to shame the person and deter others from similar behavior. In addition to alcohol, we should consider the use of various herbs and plants for altering consciousness, whether for medicinal or recreational purposes. Medieval herbals, books that described plants and their properties, listed hundreds of 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 plants and their uses. Many of these plants had some effect on the mind or mood, though often these effects were subtle. Valerian, for example, was used as a sedative and sleep aid. The root of the valerian plant, when dried and prepared as a tea or tincture, produces a mild calming effect. A person drinking valerian tea might feel relaxed and sleepy after an hour or so. The effect was not dramatic, but for someone suffering from anxiety or insomnia, it could be helpful. The taste and smell of valerian are quite unpleasant, however often described as similar to dirty socks, which may have limited its recreational appeal. St. John's wort, a plant with bright yellow flowers, was used to treat melancholy, what we might today call depression. Modern research has confirmed that St. John's wort has some antidepressant effects, though exactly how it works is still not fully understood. A medieval person taking St. John's wort regularly might notice a gradual improvement in their mood over several weeks, though they might not attribute this to the herb itself. Lavender was used for its calming properties. The flowers could be dried and placed in sachets to scent clothing and linens, or they could be prepared as a tea. The scent of lavender is pleasant to most people and does have mild relaxing effects. Someone using lavender might feel slightly more calm and might sleep better, though again, the effect is subtle. Chamomile, a plant with small daisy-like flowers, was and still is used as a mild sedative. Chamomile tea has a pleasant, slightly apple-like flavor and can help with relaxation and sleep. A person drinking chamomile tea before bed might fall asleep more easily and sleep more soundly, though they would not experience any dramatic change in consciousness. These herbal remedies were part of everyday life in medieval times. Most households would have had a small garden where they grew common medicinal herbs. Knowledge of these herbs and their uses was passed down through generations, primarily through oral tradition, though there were also written herbals available to those who could read. The experience of using these herbs was quite different from using more powerful intoxicants. There was no sudden rush of effects, no dramatic alteration of consciousness. Instead, there would be a subtle shift in how the person felt, often so gradual that they might not notice it happening. This gentle, almost imperceptible quality is part of what makes discussing these substances somewhat boring, which is of course the point of this narrative. We should also consider the role of fasting in altering consciousness. Fasting was an important part of medieval religious practice. During Lent, the 40 days before Easter, Christians were expected to fast, abstaining from meat and sometimes from other foods as well. There were also fast days throughout the year when similar restrictions applied. The experience of fasting could produce altered states of consciousness. After several days without food, or with very limited food, a person would begin to feel lightheaded and weak. Their thinking might become less clear, and they might experience mild hallucinations or visions, especially if they combined fasting with prayer and meditation. Some medieval mystics deliberately used fasting as a way to achieve religious visions and spiritual experiences. Catherine of Siena, a 14th century mystic and saint, was known for her extreme fasting. She would sometimes go for days eating nothing but the communion wafer and drinking nothing but water. She reported having vivid visions of Jesus and experiencing mystical unions with God. While her experiences were understood by her contemporaries as genuine religious experiences, modern scholars might note that prolonged fasting can indeed produce hallucinations and altered states of consciousness due to low blood sugar and other physiological effects. The practice of self-flagellation, whipping oneself as a form of penance, could also produce altered consciousness. The pain and stress of the whipping would cause the body to release endorphins, natural pain-relieving chemicals that can produce a sense of euphoria. Some medieval flagellants reported experiencing religious ecstasy during their self-punishment. Whether this was purely a result of endorphin release or whether it also involved a psychological component of religious fervor is difficult to say. We should return now to the experience of alcohol intoxication, as this was by far the most common way medieval people altered their consciousness. Let us consider in detail what it would be like to attend a medieval feast where wine flowed freely. The feast would take place in a great hall, a large room with high ceilings and long tables. Tapestries might hang on the walls to provide insulation and decoration. A fire would burn in a large fireplace or, in earlier periods, in a hearth in the center of the room with the smoke escaping through a hole in the roof. The feast would begin in the late afternoon and could continue for many hours, sometimes lasting until late at night. Servants would bring course after course of food. There might be roasted meats including beef, pork, venison, and various birds. There would be fish, especially on fast days when meat was forbidden. There would be pies, stews, and various dishes made with vegetables, grains, and legumes. And there would be sweets, including fruits, nuts, and confections made with honey or sugar. Throughout the meal, wine would be poured repeatedly. The guests would drink from cups that were refilled as soon as they were emptied. The wine would be strong, much stronger than the ale consumed daily by common people. As the evening progressed and the wine flowed, the atmosphere would become increasingly boisterous. Initially, people would eat and drink while conversing politely with their neighbors at the table. As they consumed more wine, their conversations would become louder and more animated. They would laugh more readily at jokes and stories. Some might become amorous, flirting with others at the table. Others might become argumentative, debating points of theology, politics, or personal honor with increasing passion. Entertainment would be provided during the feast. Musicians would play instruments including lutes, harps, drums, and various wind instruments. Singers would perform songs, both religious and secular. Jugglers, acrobats, and other performers might entertain the guests between courses. As the guests became more intoxicated, they would appreciate these performances more enthusiastically, applauding and cheering. By the end of the evening, some guests would be quite drunk. They might have difficulty standing or walking straight. Their speech would be slurred and rambling. Some might fall asleep at the table. Others might need to be helped to their chambers by servants. A few might become sick, vomiting from the excess of food and wine. This was considered somewhat embarrassing, but not terribly shocking, as it was understood that such things happened at feasts. The next day, many of the feast attendees would wake with hangovers. They would feel nauseated and headachy. Their mouths would be dry and they would be extremely thirsty. They might vomit or have diarrhea. They would be extremely thirsty. They might vomit or have diarrhea. They would be extremely thirsty. They might vomit or have diarrhea. They would be extremely thirsty. They might vomit or have diarrhea. They would be extremely thirsty. They might vomit or have diarrhea. They would be extremely thirsty. They might vomit or have diarrhea. Likely spend the day resting and recovering, drinking water or weak ale to rehydrate and eating simple foods, like bread or porridge. By the following day, they would usually feel recovered and ready to resume their normal activities. This pattern of occasional excessive drinking at feasts combined with regular moderate drinking of ale throughout daily life, was typical for many medieval people, at least those of sufficient social standing to be invited to feasts. For common peasants and laborers, opportunities for such excess were less frequent, though they might drink more heavily at village festivals or on religious holidays. Now let us consider the specific physiological effects of alcohol in more detail. When a person drinks an alcoholic beverage, that alcohol is absorbed through the stomach and small intestine into the bloodstream. This process begins within minutes of drinking and continues for as long as there is alcohol in the digestive system. The rate of absorption depends on various factors, including whether the person has eaten recently, their body weight, and their biological sex. Once in the bloodstream, alcohol travels throughout the body, including to the brain. In the brain, alcohol affects neurotransmitters, the chemicals that nerve cells use to communicate with each other. Alcohol enhances the effect of GABA, an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which slows down brain activity. It also inhibits glutamate, an excitatory neurotransmitter, which further reduces brain activity. These effects combine to produce the characteristic sensations of alcohol intoxication. At low doses, the effects are primarily on the parts of the brain responsible for inhibition and judgment. The person feels relaxed and less anxious. They become more talkative and social. They may take risks they would normally avoid. As the dose increases, motor coordination begins to be affected. The person may become clumsy, stumbling or dropping things. Their reaction time slows. Their vision may become blurry or doubled. At higher doses, cognitive functions become impaired. The person has difficulty thinking clearly or remembering things. Their speech becomes slurred. They may experience mood swings, becoming euphoric one moment and sad or angry the next. At very high doses, the person may lose consciousness. At extremely high doses, alcohol can suppress the brain's control of breathing and heart rate, potentially leading to death, though this is relatively rare with the alcoholic beverages available in medieval times due to their limited alcohol content. The body metabolizes alcohol, primarily in the liver, through a series of chemical reactions. The liver can process roughly 1 standard drink per hour, though this varies between individuals. Any alcohol consumed faster, this rate will accumulate in the bloodstream, increasing intoxication. Once all the alcohol has been metabolized, the person will gradually return to a normal state, though they may feel the effects of hangover for some time afterward. A hangover is caused by several factors. Dehydration plays a role, as alcohol is a diuretic, causing the body to produce more urine and lose fluids. Disrupted sleep is another factor, as alcohol interferes with normal sleep patterns, preventing the deep, restorative sleep the body needs. Alcohol also irritates the stomach lining, which can cause nausea and abdominal discomfort. The accumulation of acetaldehyde, a toxic byproduct of alcohol metabolism, also contributes to hangover symptoms. Medieval people did not understand the biochemistry of alcohol metabolism, but they understood hangovers from experience. Various folk remedies were used to treat hangovers. Some people believe that drinking more alcohol the next day would help. The hair of the dog that bit you, as the saying goes. This might provide temporary relief by delaying the hangover, but it would ultimately make the situation worse. Other remedies included drinking water, eating certain foods, or taking herbal preparations. The effectiveness of these treatments varied, though staying hydrated and getting rest were and are genuinely helpful. Let us now turn our attention to the cultivation and preparation of various intoxicating or medicinal plants. The opium poppy, as mentioned earlier, was grown in some parts of medieval Europe, particularly in monastic gardens, where monks grew medicinal plants. The cultivation of poppies was straightforward. Seeds would be planted in the spring in well-drained soil. The plants would grow through the summer, producing distinctive flowers that could be white, pink, purple, or red. After the flowers faded, seed pods would form. To harvest opium, the seed pods would be scored with a small knife while still green and attached to the plant. This scoring would cause the milky latex to ooze out. The latex would be collected and allowed to dry, turning brown and sticky. This dried latex was opium. The process was labor-intensive, as each pod had to be scored carefully, and the latex collected before it dried on the pod. For this reason, opium production was limited, and the resulting product was expensive. The opium would then be stored in sealed containers to preserve it. When needed for medicinal use, a small amount would be dissolved in wine or mixed with other ingredients to create the desired preparation. The dosage was estimated based on experience rather than any precise measurement, which made it easy to accidentally give too much or too little. The effects of opium would begin within an hour of ingestion. The person would feel a warm, pleasant sensation spreading through their body. Any pain they were experiencing would diminish or disappear entirely. They would feel drowsy and content. Their breathing would slow and become more shallow. Their pupils would constrict to small points. If the dose was appropriate, they would fall into a deep sleep and wake several hours later, feeling rested, though possibly constipated, and somewhat groggy. If the dose was too high, the person might slip into unconsciousness, from which they could not be roused. Their breathing might become dangerously slow and shallow. Their skin might turn blue from lack of oxygen. In the worst cases, they might stop breathing entirely and die. Medieval physicians were aware of this risk and tried to be cautious with opium. But accidents did occur. Regular use of opium led to tolerance, meaning that increasingly large doses were needed to achieve the same effect. It also led to dependence, meaning that stopping the drug would cause withdrawal symptoms, including agitation, sweating, muscle aches, and intense craving for more opium. Medieval physicians observed these effects and warned against prolonged use of opium, except when absolutely necessary. Mandrake cultivation was surrounded by superstition. As mentioned earlier, the root was believed to scream when pulled from the ground. This belief may have arisen from the root's vaguely humanoid shape, which led people to attribute human qualities to it. In reality, mandrake is simply a plant and makes no sound when harvested, though it does require some effort to pull up due to its deep taproot. The mandrake plant has dark green leaves that grow in a rosette at ground level. In spring, it produces purple or greenish flowers, followed by yellow or orange fruits, sometimes called mandrake apples. All parts of the plant contain tropane alkaloids and are therefore poisonous. The root, being the most substantial part, contains the highest concentration of these alkaloids. To prepare mandrake for medicinal use, the root would be cleaned, dried, and ground into a powder. This powder could be mixed with wine or other liquids to create a sedative or anesthetic. The potential was critical. Too little would have no effect. Too much could cause severe toxicity or death. Medieval physicians tried to determine the correct dose through trial and error, a dangerous process that undoubtedly led to some unfortunate outcomes. The experience of taking a therapeutic dose of mandrake would be similar to taking other tropane-containing plants. The person would feel drowsy and confused. They might experience hallucinations or delirium. Their mouth would become very dry, and they might have difficulty urinating. Their heart rate might increase. If the dose was sufficient, they would lose consciousness, which was the desired effect when mandrake was being used as an anesthetic for surgery. After Brugge and the effects wore off, the person would likely have little or no memory of the experience. They would feel groggy and disoriented for some time. If they had undergone surgery while under the influence of mandrake, they would wake to find the surgery completed, though they would still have to deal with the pain and complications of the surgery itself, as there were no antibiotics or modern wound care techniques available. We should also discuss the various preparations and mixtures that combined multiple psychoactive substances. Theriac, mentioned earlier, was one such preparation. The recipe for theriac was complex and varied depending on the source, but it typically included dozens of ingredients. Opium was almost always one of these ingredients. Others might include various herbs, spices, minerals, and even powdered gemstones or gold, based on the medieval belief in the medicinal properties of such substances. The preparation of theriac was a long and involved process. The ingredients would be gathered, measured, and combined according to the recipe. The mixture would then be aged for a period of time, sometimes years, before being considered ready for use. Theriac was believed to be a cure-all medicine, effective against poisoning, plague, and various other ailments. In reality, its effectiveness was likely due primarily to the opium it contained, which would relieve pain and produce a sense of well-being, regardless of the underlying condition. A person taking theriac would experience effects similar to taking opium alone, though the other ingredients might contribute some additional effects or side effects. They would feel pain relief, drowsiness, and contentment. The psychological aspect of taking such a highly regarded and expensive medicine might also contribute to a placebo effect, where the person felt better, partly because they believed the medicine would help them. Another preparation worth mentioning is wine infused with various herbs and spices. Hippocras, discussed earlier, was one example. Another was claret, which was spiced wine similar to modern mulled wine, These preparations were consumed both for pleasure and for their believed medicinal properties. The spices added flavor and were thought to aid digestion and warm the body. The experience of drinking spiced wine would be similar to drinking regular wine, with the added complexity of flavor from the spices. The alcohol would produce the standard effects of intoxication, while the spices might provide some mild physiological effect. Ginger, for example, can aid digestion and reduce nausea. Cinnamon might help regulate blood sugar, though these effects would be subtle and the drinker might not consciously notice them. Let us consider now the social and cultural attitudes toward intoxication in different segments of medieval society. Among the nobility and wealthy merchants, moderate drinking was expected and encouraged as part of social life. Feasts and banquets were important occasions for building social bonds, conducting business, and displaying wealth and status. The ability to provide abundant food and drink to one's guests was a mark of prosperity and generosity. However, excessive drinking to the point of obvious drunkenness was generally considered inappropriate, especially for those of high social status, who were expected to maintain dignity and self-control. A nobleman who regularly drank to excess might be criticized or mocked by his peers. That said, occasional overindulgence at feasts was somewhat tolerated, as long as it was not a regular habit. Among the peasantry and working classes, attitudes were similar, but the opportunities for excess were more limited. Common people drank ale daily with their meals, but the low alcohol content meant they remained relatively sober. On feast days, festivals, and religious holidays, there were opportunities to drink more heavily and celebrate. These occasions were important breaks from the hard labor of daily life, and temporary drunkenness was more acceptable. The church, as mentioned earlier, took a nuanced view. Wine was sacred, used in the Eucharist, and moderate drinking was acceptable. However, drunkenness was sinful. Medieval preachers would often warn against the dangers of excessive drinking in their sermons. They would describe how drunkenness could lead to other sins, how it could ruin families and waste resources, and how it could prevent a person from attending to their religious duties. Despite these warnings, drinking remained an important part of medieval life. Taverns and alehouses continued to flourish. Feasts continued to feature abundant wine. People continued to get drunk on occasion, and the next day they would repent, attend church, and carry on with their lives. Let us now examine specific historical accounts of intoxication in medieval times. One interesting case is that of the medieval writer Geoffrey Chaucer. In his Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, Chaucer provides various descriptions of drinking and drunkenness. In the Pardoner's Tale, he writes extensively about the evils of gluttony and drunkenness, describing how drink can rob a man of his senses and lead him to sin. However, Chaucer also depicts drinking as a normal and even enjoyable part of life. In the general prologue, he describes the various pilgrims, many of whom are fond of good food and drink. The Franklin, for example, is described as living in delight and pleasure, with wine and food always ready in his house. The description suggests that Chaucer, like many of his contemporaries, saw moderate drinking as acceptable and even praiseworthy, while condemning excess. Another historical figure worth mentioning is the medieval physician Arnoldus de Villanova, who lived in the 13th and 14th centuries. He wrote extensively about medicine and was particularly interested in the medicinal properties of wine and distilled spirits. Arnoldus was one of the early advocates of distillation in Europe, a process that had been developed earlier in the Islamic world and was gradually spreading to Christian Europe. Distillation involves heating wine or fermented grain mash and collecting the vapors, which condense into a liquid with much higher alcohol content than the original material. The resulting spirit could be as much as 50 to 70% alcohol, far stronger than wine or ale. These distilled spirits were initially used primarily as medicine rather than for drinking, though recreational use would increase in later periods. Arnoldus called distilled wine aqua vitae, water of life, and claimed it had remarkable medicinal properties. He believed it could cure almost any ailment, restore youth, and even prolong life. In reality, distilled spirits have the same basic effects as other forms of alcohol, just in a more concentrated form. Drinking a small amount of aqua vitae would produce rapid intoxication due to the high alcohol content. The experience of drinking distilled spirits would have been quite different from both drinking wine or ale. The taste would be much harsher and more burning. A small sip would create a burning sensation in the mouth and throat, followed by a warm feeling in the stomach. Within minutes, the person would begin to feel the effects of the alcohol as the high concentration allowed for rapid absorption. If they drank too much, too quickly, they could become severely intoxicated or even alcohol poisoned. However, we should emphasize that distilled spirits were not common in the medieval period we have been primarily discussing. Distillation became more widespread in the late medieval and early modern periods. For most of the Middle Ages, wine and ale were the primary alcoholic beverages, and the experience of getting high, as we have been exploring, was almost entirely limited to these lower alcohol content drinks and the occasional use of medicinal plants. Let us consider the experience of a typical day for a medieval person in terms of consciousness alteration. They would wake in the morning, perhaps slightly hungover if they had drunk too much the previous evening, but more likely feeling normal. They would breakfast on bread and ale. The ale would provide a small amount of alcohol, but not enough to cause noticeable intoxication. They would then go about their daily work, whether that was farming, craft work, trade, or household tasks. At midday, they would stop for a meal of bread, cheese, or other food, and more ale. Again, the alcohol intake would be modest. In the afternoon, they would continue working. In the evening, they would have their main meal, again accompanied by ale. After the evening meal, they might socialize with family or neighbors, perhaps drinking a bit more ale. On most days, the total amount of alcohol consumed would keep them in a state of very mild, barely noticeable intoxication. If that, they would remain functional and able to work. The alcohol would provide some calories and nutrition, and the slight mood elevation might make the day's labor more bearable. But there would be no dramatic alteration of consciousness, no feeling of being high in the way we might understand it today. On special occasions, feast days, festivals, or celebrations, the pattern would be different. On these days, they might drink wine instead of or in addition to ale. They might drink more than usual. By the end of the evening, they might be genuinely drunk with all the accompanying effects we have discussed. But these occasions would be relatively infrequent, perhaps a few times a year for most common people. For a monk or nun living in a monastery or convent, the pattern would be somewhat different. Monasteries typically brewed their own ale or beer, and wine was used for religious ceremonies. Monks and nuns would drink ale with their meals, just as lay people did. However, monastic rules often specified limits on alcohol consumption to prevent drunkenness, which was seen as particularly inappropriate for those dedicated to religious life. Some monasteries became famous for their brewing or winemaking skills. Monks had the time, resources, and literacy to experiment with different recipes and techniques, and some monastic beverages became highly prized. The tradition of Belgian Trappist beers, for example, has its roots in medieval monastic brewing, though the specific modern styles developed later. Monks who worked in the monastery's infirmary might have access to medicinal substances, including opium, mandrake, and various herbs. They would use these to treat sick or injured members of the community. The experience of taking these medicines would be as described earlier, but within the context of monastic life, where the focus was on healing and return to health rather than on any recreational aspect of the drugs. We should also consider the experience of medieval soldiers and mercenaries. Military campaigns in the medieval period often involved long periods of waiting and boredom punctuated by brief moments of intense violence. During the waiting periods, soldiers would often drink to pass the time and cope with the stress and boredom. After battles, they might drink heavily to celebrate victory or to forget the horrors they had witnessed. However, military commanders generally tried to maintain some level of discipline and prevent excessive drunkenness among their troops, as drunk soldiers were ineffective fighters and prone to causing problems. Alcohol rations might be controlled, and soldiers who became drunk at inappropriate times might be punished. The experience of a soldier getting drunk in a military camp would be similar to anyone else getting drunk, but the context would color the experience. The camaraderie of drinking with fellow soldiers, the shared experiences of combat, and the ever-present possibility of death would all influence how the intoxication felt and what it meant to the soldier. Let us turn now to the question of addiction in medieval times. The concept of addiction, as we understand it today, as a medical condition involving physical and psychological dependence, was not fully developed in the medieval period. However, medieval people certainly observed that some individuals seemed unable to control their drinking or use of other substances. People who regularly drank to excess despite negative consequences might be described as drunkards or sots. They might be subjects of moral condemnation, seen as weak-willed or sinful rather than as suffering from a disease. There was little understanding of the physiological basis of addiction, and treatment options were limited. Someone who was dependent on alcohol would experience withdrawal symptoms if they stopped drinking abruptly. These symptoms could include tremors, sweating, anxiety, nausea, and in severe cases, seizures or delirium tremens, a potentially fatal condition involving hallucinations and severe confusion. Medieval observers would notice these symptoms, but might interpret them as evidence of demonic possession or divine punishment, rather than as a medical condition. Similarly, someone who regularly used opium for medical reasons might develop physical dependence. If they stopped taking the drug, they would experience withdrawal symptoms, including agitation, sweating, muscle aches, dilated pupils, and intense craving for more opium. These symptoms, while very unpleasant, were rarely fatal. Unlike alcohol withdrawal, which could be, medieval physicians recognized that stopping opium after prolonged use could cause these symptoms, and some recommended gradual reduction of the dose, rather than abrupt cessation. However, the understanding of why this happened was limited. The concept of physical dependence and the changes in brain chemistry that underlie addiction were centuries away from being discovered. Let us now consider the intersection of intoxication and religion in more detail. As mentioned earlier, wine was central to Christian religious practice. During the Mass, wine was consecrated and, according to Catholic doctrine, transformed into the actual blood of Christ through the process of transubstantiation. This meant that drinking wine was not just a secular activity, but could also be a sacred one. The experience of receiving communion wine would be different from regular wine drinking. The amount consumed was typically very small, just a sip, and the context was ritualistic and solemn. The communicant would approach the altar, receive a small amount of wine from the priest, and swallow it while contemplating its sacred significance. There would be no intoxication from such a small amount, but the psychological and spiritual impact might be considerable for a devout believer. Some medieval mystics reported experiencing religious ecstasy or visions during or after taking communion. Whether these experiences were purely psychological, the result of intense religious devotion and expectation, or whether they involved some physiological component, perhaps related to fasting or other ascetic practices, is difficult to determine. What is clear is that for these individuals, the experience of taking wine in a religious context could produce profound alterations of consciousness that they interpreted as direct encounters with the divine. Another religious context for alcohol consumption was the celebration of religious festivals. Saints' days, Christmas, Easter, and other important dates in the church calendar were often marked with feasting and drinking. These celebrations served both religious and social functions, strengthening community bonds while honoring sacred occasions. The experience of drinking during these religious festivals would combine elements of regular celebratory drinking with religious significance. People would be conscious that they were celebrating a holy day, which might influence how they understood and experienced their intoxication. Drunkenness might be more acceptable on these occasions than at other times, as long as it remained within certain bounds and did not interfere with religious observances. Pilgrimages, journeys to holy sites, were another context where drinking played a role. Pilgrims would often stop at taverns and inns along their route, and drinking was a normal part of the pilgrimage experience. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, mentioned earlier, depicts a group of pilgrims traveling together and telling stories to pass the time, with drinking implied throughout. The experience of drinking while on pilgrimage would be colored by the religious purpose of the journey. Pilgrims might feel that they were in a liminal space between their normal, everyday life and the sacred destination they were traveling toward. This might make the drinking experience feel different, more significant or meaningful than ordinary drinking at home. Let us now examine the preparation and consumption of various foods and drinks in more detail as the context of consumption affected the experience. Bread, the staple food for most medieval people, was made from various grains including wheat, rye, barley, and oats. The quality of bread varied greatly depending on social class. The wealthy ate fine, white bread made from wheat flour. The poor ate coarse dark bread made from rye or barley, sometimes mixed with beans or other ingredients. Bread was typically eaten with every meal and was often used as a utensil or plate. A thick slice of stale bread, called a trencher, might serve as a plate for other foods. After the meal, the gravy-soaked trencher could be eaten, given to servants or the poor, or fed to animals. The practice of eating bread with ale meant that the alcohol was consumed along with food. which would slow its absorption and reduce intoxication compared to drinking on an empty stomach. Cheese was another common food. It could be made from cow, sheep, or goat milk and came in many varieties. Cheese was a valuable source of protein and fat, and it could be stored for long periods, making it an important food, particularly in winter, when fresh milk was less available. Cheese was more often eaten with bread and ale, providing a simple but nutritious meal. Vegetables including onions, cabbage, leeks, peas, and beans were important parts of the diet, especially for common people who could not afford much meat. These would be made into pottages, thick soups or stews that simmered for hours. A pot of pottage might be kept over the fire, continuously, with new ingredients added as more others were consumed. This provided a constant source of hot food that could be eaten with bread. Meat, when available, would be roasted, boiled, or made into pies. Preservation methods included salting, smoking, and drying. Salted or smoked meat could be very salty and tough, requiring soaking and long cooking to make it palatable. Fresh meat was a luxury for most people, reserved for special occasions. The experience of eating these foods while drinking ale or wine would affect how the alcohol was absorbed and experienced. A person who ate a large meal of bread, cheese, and meat before drinking would become intoxicated more slowly than someone drinking on an empty stomach. The food would slow the emptying of the stomach, delaying the passage of alcohol into the small intestine where most absorption occurs. This means that at a feast, where eating and drinking proceeded together over several hours, guests would become gradually intoxicated as the evening progressed. The slow onset of intoxication, combined with the social context and entertainment, would create a particular quality of experience, different from rapid intoxication, from drinking without eating. Let us consider the specific experience of different types of wine available in medieval Europe. Wine from Bordeaux in France was highly prized in England, especially after the region came under English control, following the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II in 1152. Bordeaux wine, called claret by the English, was typically red and was the most commonly imported wine in England for several centuries. The experience of drinking claret would depend on the specific vintage and how it had been stored and transported. Wine quality could vary greatly. Good wine would be relatively smooth and pleasant to drink. Poor quality wine might be harsh, acidic, and unpleasant. Wine could also spoil during storage or transport, becoming vinegary or otherwise undrinkable. Wine from the Rhine region in Germany was also valued, particularly white wines. These would typically be crisper and more acidic than modern German wines, as winemaking techniques were different. The experience of drinking Rhine wine would be refreshing, particularly in warm port weather, though the high acidity might be jarring to modern palates. Spanish wines, including those from Dont Jerez, which would later become famous for sherry, were available in some parts of Europe. Italian wines from Dont regions, including Tuscany and Piedmont, were consumed both locally and exported to other areas. Each region's wines had distinctive characteristics based on the grape varieties used, the climate, and the winemaking techniques. The experience of drinking these various wines would differ in the specific flavors and qualities, but basic effects of the alcohol would be the same. All would cause intoxication if consumed in sufficient quantity, producing the familiar progression of and effects we have described: initial relaxation and euphoria, followed by impaired judgment and coordination, and eventually severe intoxication or unconsciousness if drinking continued. Let us now turn our attention to some specific herbal preparations and their effects. We have mentioned several plants already, but let us explore a few more. Wormwood, a bitter herb, was used to make various medicines and was also an ingredient in some alcoholic drinks. Wormwood contains thuone, a compound that in large doses can cause seizures and other toxic effects, though the amounts typically consumed would not reach toxic levels. The experience of drinking a wormwood preparation would be characterized first by its intensely bitter taste. The person's face would in a wormwood preparation would be characterized first by its intensely bitter taste. The person's face would likely pucker at the bitterness. After swallowing, there would be a lingering, bitter aftertaste. If the preparation contained alcohol, the alcohol effects would predominate. The wormwood itself might contribute a very subtle alteration of consciousness, though this is debatable and would be difficult to distinguish from placebo effects or the effects of the alcohol. Mugwort, another Artemisia species related to wormwood, was used in medieval times as a flavoring for beer before hops became common. It was also believed to have medicinal properties and to induce vivid dreams. Some people would place mugwort under their pillow or drink mugwort tea before bed in the hope of having prophetic or significant dreams. The experience of using mugwort would be subtle. The person might notice that their dreams seemed more vivid or memorable than usual. Whether this was a genuine pharmacological effect or a result of expectation and increased attention to dreams is unclear. Modern research has not confirmed any strong psychoactive effects of mugwort, though it does contain some compounds that could theoretically affect consciousness. Catnip, known for its effects on cats, was also used by humans in medieval times. It was made into tea and used as a mild sedative. The experience of drinking catnip tea would be generally relaxing. The person would feel calm and might become slightly drowsy. The effect would be gentle and would probably not be noticed by someone who was not paying attention to their inner state. Lemon balm, a member of the mint family, was another herb used for calming and uplifting the mood. Tea made from lemon balm leaves has a pleasant, slightly lemony flavor and can help with relaxation and mild anxiety. Medieval people might drink lemon balm tea in the evening to help them unwind after a day of work. The experience would be subtle but pleasant, a gentle easing of tension and worry. These herbal remedies were part of everyday self-care in medieval times. They were not dramatic in their effects, and they were not used to get high in the recreational sense. Rather, they were used to gently modify mood and promote well-being. This subtle, health-focused approach to consciousness alteration was much more common than the use of powerful intoxicants. Let us return to consideration of opium once more, as it was the most powerful intoxicant regularly used in medieval Europe for medical purposes. We have discussed its effects, but let us explore the experience in more detail. When a person in pain took opium, the relief would come gradually. First, they might notice a general sense of warmth and comfort. Then, the pain would begin to recede, not disappearing suddenly, but fading slowly like the sun setting. As the pain diminished, the person would feel an increasing sense of contentment and peace. Worries and anxieties would seem less pressing. The world would take on a dreamlike quality. If they closed their eyes, they might see vague images or patterns. Their thoughts might wander in pleasant, meandering paths. Time would seem to slow down or become irrelevant. Eventually, drowsiness would overcome them, and they would drift into sleep. This sleep would be deep and undisturbed by the usual tossing and turning or frequent waking that often accompanies pain. Hours would pass in what seemed like moments. When they woke, they might feel disoriented, not immediately remembering where they were or what had happened. The pain might have returned, though often it would be lessened. The person would also notice physical effects. Their bowels would be sluggish, often leading to constipation, a common side effect of opium. Their pupils would be very small, pinpointed. They might feel slightly nauseated or itchy. Despite these less pleasant effects, if they had been in severe pain before taking the opium, they would likely feel grateful for the relief it provided. Regular use of opium, as might occur in someone with chronic pain, would lead to tolerance. The same dose that initially provided good pain relief would become less effective over time. The person would need to increase the dose to achieve the same effect. This could continue until the doses became dangerous or until opium was no longer available or affordable. If a regular opium user stopped taking the drug, whether by choice or because they could not obtain more, they would experience withdrawal. The first symptoms would appear within hours of the last dose. They would feel anxious and restless. They would yawn frequently and their eyes would water. They would sweat and feel alternately hot and cold. Their nose would run and their pupils would dilate widely. As the withdrawal progressed, more severe symptoms would appear. Their muscles would ache intensely. They might have severe abdominal cramps and diarrhea. They would be unable to sleep despite feeling exhausted. They would have an overwhelming craving for more opium. These symptoms would peak around 2 to 3 days after the last dose and would gradually subside over the course of a week or two. The experience of opium withdrawal was and is extremely unpleasant, though unlike alcohol withdrawal, it is rarely life-threatening. A medieval person experiencing these symptoms might not understand that they were caused by cessation of the drug. They might believe they were suffering from a new illness or from divine punishment. If they resumed taking opium, the symptoms would quickly disappear, reinforcing the dependence. Let us now consider the experience of herbal healing more broadly. When a medieval person fell ill, they might consult a physician if they were wealthy. or they might rely on folk remedies passed down through generations or administered by a local wise woman or cunning man. Many of these remedies involved herbs prepared in various ways. A simple herbal tea might be made by pouring boiling water over dried or fresh herbs and allowing them to steep. The resulting infusion would be strained and drunk, often with honey added to improve the taste. The Porsai experience would be similar to drinking any hot beverage, with the added element of the herb's flavor and any subtle effects it might have. A tincture, an alcohol-based herbal extract, would be made by soaking herbs in wine or distilled spirits for a period of days or weeks. The alcohol would extract the active compounds from the herbs, creating a concentrated preparation. A few drops or a small spoonful of tincture would be mixed with water or wine and drunk. The taste would typically be strong and often unpleasant, and the person would feel the effects of both the herb and the alcohol. Poultices and salves would be made by crushing or grinding herbs and mixing them with a base, such as lard or beeswax. These would be applied to the skin to treat wounds, rashes, or pain. The experience would be primarily local to the area of application, though some herbs could be absorbed through the skin as systemic effects. The psychological component of herbal healing should not be underestimated. A person who believed strongly in the efficacy of a particular remedy would likely experience some benefit, even if the herb itself had limited pharmacological activity. This placebo effect was and is a real phenomenon that can produce genuine improvements in symptoms. Similarly, the care and attention involved in preparing and administering herbal remedies had value beyond the physical effects of the herbs. A mother brewing a tea for her sick child, a monk carefully measuring out a tincture for a patient in the infirmary, or a cunning woman gathering herbs by moonlight and chanting prayers over them as they prepared a healing salve were all providing not just medicine but also care, compassion, and hope. Let us consider the seasonal variations in drinking and intoxication patterns. In the summer, when the weather was warm and the days were long, people might drink more frequently to quench their thirst. However, the ale they drank would often be weaker in the summer. A stronger ale would spoil more quickly in the heat. Drinking would often take place outdoors, in gardens, or in front of taverns, and the atmosphere would be lighter and more social. In the winter, when the weather was cold and dark, people might drink less frequently but consume stronger beverages when they did drink. The warmth from alcohol would be welcome on a cold day. Drinking would typically take place indoors, around a fire. The atmosphere might be more subdued, with people gathering for warmth and companionship during the long, dark evenings. Harvest time in the autumn was a period of particularly heavy drinking in agricultural communities. The harvest was hard work, but it was also a time of celebration and relief that the year's crops were safely gathered. Harvest festivals would feature abundant food and drink, and workers would be rewarded for their labor with extra rations of ale or wine. The experience of drinking at harvest time would be colored by the satisfaction of completing the agricultural year and the anticipation of winter ahead. Spring, with its religious festivals including Easter and its association with renewal and rebirth, had its own drinking traditions. Spring ales were brewed specifically for the season, and drinking was part of the celebration of the return of life after winter's dormancy. Let us explore the daily schedule of drinking in a medieval household in more detail. The day would begin at dawn or shortly after breakfast. A relatively light meal would typically consist of bread and ale, perhaps with some cheese or cold meat left from the previous day. The ale would be weak, perhaps 1 to 2% alcohol, and the amount consumed would be moderate, perhaps a cup or two. This would provide hydration and some calories to start the day's work. Mid-morning, bonfire workers in the fields or at other heavy labor might take a break for more bread and ale. This break, sometimes called tiffin or bever, would help sustain them through the morning's exertions. Again, the amount consumed would be moderate and the alcohol content low. The midday meal would be the first substantial meal of the day for many people. It would typically include bread, ale, and whatever hot food was available, perhaps pottage or on special occasions, meat or fish. More ale would be consumed with this meal, but again, the goal was refreshment and nutrition rather than intoxication. The afternoon would be spent at work, with perhaps another break for bread and ale in the late afternoon. The evening meal, taken as daylight faded, would be the main meal of the day. This would include the best food available and would be accompanied by ale or, for the wealthy, wine. More drinking might occur after the meal as people relaxed before bed. Over the course of the day, a working person might consume 2 to 3 quarts of ale. Given the low alcohol content, this would represent a total alcohol intake similar to drinking 2 or 3 modern beers. The effects would accumulate gradually over the day, producing at most a mild, constant state of very slight intoxication that would not significantly impair function. On feast days or festivals, the pattern would be different. Drinking might begin earlier and continue later. The beverages consumed might be stronger. The total alcohol intake would be much higher. By the end of such a day, many people would be genuinely intoxicated, experiencing the effects we have discussed earlier. Let us now turn to the question of how intoxication was regulated by law and custom. Most medieval towns and cities had regulations governing taverns and alehouses. These establishments were required to be licensed, and their operators could lose their licenses if they violated the rules. Common regulations included prohibiting service to known drunkards, forbidding gambling on the premises, maintaining order, and selling ale or wine at fair prices and proper measures. Ale quality was also regulated. Ale tasters or ale conners were officials who would visit brewers and taste their ale to ensure it met minimum standards. Ale that was too weak, too strong, or that had spoiled could result in fines for the brewer. In some places, brewers would hang a pole or evergreen bush outside their house when they had fresh ale ready for sale, alerting potential customers. The experience of drinking in a licensed tavern would be somewhat different from drinking at home or in an unlicensed establishment. The tavern would be a semi-public space where certain standards of behavior were expected. The tavern keeper would try to maintain order, breaking up fights or asking troublesome patrons to leave. The bay ale or wine would be of reliable quality, having been inspected by authorities. Drinking in an unlicensed establishment or private home would be less regulated. The quality of the drink might vary more. The behavior of those drinking might be less constrained. However, even in private settings, social norms would impose some limits on behavior. Excessive drunkenness, violence, or other disruptive behavior would be frowned upon and could have social consequences even if there were no legal penalties. Let us explore the experience of someone who was regularly intoxicated, what we might today call an alcoholic. In medieval times, such a person would likely be viewed with a mixture of pity and contempt. They would be seen as weak-willed, unable to control their base appetites. They might be the subject of sermons condemning the sin of gluttony and drunkenness. Their family might suffer from their neglect and the waste of resources on drink. The daily experience of such a person would be characterized by a constant need for alcohol. They would wake in the morning feeling shaky and anxious, symptoms of mild withdrawal from the previous night's drinking. They would immediately seek out ale or wine to relieve these symptoms. After drinking, they would feel temporarily better. The shaking would stop and the anxiety would ease. However, they would need to continue drinking throughout the day to maintain this state and avoid withdrawal symptoms. Their work would suffer as they would be unable to focus or perform physical labor effectively. Their relationships would deteriorate as family members and friends became frustrated with their behavior. They might lose their employment or be unable to maintain their farm or business. Despite the obvious negative consequences, the person would find it extremely difficult to stop drinking. The physical dependence would make stopping very uncomfortable, and the psychological dependence, the use of alcohol to cope with stress and negative emotions, would be equally powerful. Without understanding of addiction as a medical condition and without effective treatment options, such a person had little hope of recovery. Now let us consider the role of apprenticeship and guild systems in regulating drinking among craftsmen and workers. Many medieval crafts were organized into guilds, associations of workers in a particular trade. Guilds had rules governing many aspects of their members' lives, including drinking behavior. Excessive drinking that interfered with work quality or brought disrepute to the guild could result in fines or expulsion. Apprentices, young people learning a trade, lived with their master and were under his authority. Masters were responsible for not only teaching their apprentices the skills of the craft, but also for their moral education and behavior. And an apprentice who drank excessively might be disciplined by the master, perhaps through reduced food rations, confinement, or physical punishment. The experience of an apprentice drinking would typically be limited and controlled. They might be allowed ale with meals, but would not have access to large quantities or to wine except on special occasions. As they progressed in their training and eventually became journeymen and then masters themselves, they would have more freedom, but also more responsibility regarding their drinking behavior. Guild feast days were occasions when more drinking was permitted and expected. These feasts served to strengthen bonds among guild members and celebrate the patron saint of the guild or other important occasions. The experience of drinking at a guild feast would combine elements of work, identity with social celebration. The drinking would be communal and regulated by the social hierarchy of the guild, with masters having precedence over journeymen and apprentices. Let us examine the medical understanding of alcohol's effects in more detail. Medieval physicians working within the framework of humoral theory inherited from ancient Greek medicine understood health as a balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with certain qualities. Blood was hot and moist, phlegm was cold and moist, yellow bile was hot and dry, and black bile was cold and dry. Wine was considered hot and dry in its qualities. This meant that drinking wine would increase the hot and dry humors in the body. For someone with a cold and moist constitution, wine might be beneficial, warming and drying them. For someone who was already hot and dry, wine might cause problems by creating excess heat and dryness. Physicians would consider a patient's humoral constitution when prescribing or prohibiting wine. The experience of drinking wine would thus be understood through this humoral framework. A person might feel wine warming their body, driving out cold and moisture. They might understand their increased energy and confidence as a result of wine heating their blood. The eventual lethargy and stupor from excessive drinking might be understood as the wine disrupting the balance of humors. Medieval physicians also recognized that different wines had different qualities depending on where they were produced, how old they were, and other factors. Young wine was considered hotter than aged wine. White wine was seen as less heating than red wine. Sweet wine was thought to be more nourishing than dry wine. These distinctions would influence which wines were prescribed for different conditions. The actual experience of drinking these different wines would vary in the ways we have discussed, with differences in flavor, alcohol content, and other properties. Whether the humoral explanations had any validity is questionable from a modern scientific perspective, but they provided a framework for understanding had any validity is questionable from a modern scientific perspective, but they provided a framework for understanding and discussing the effects of alcohol that made sense within medieval medical theory. Let us now consider the experience of different times of life in relation to drinking. Children in medieval times did drink ale, as it was safer than water and provided nutrition. However, the ale given to children was typically very weak, often described as small ale. This might be only 1% alcohol or less. Children would drink it with meals and would not experience intoxication, except perhaps on rare occasions when they might be given stronger ale at a celebration. The experience of a child drinking small ale would be unremarkable. It would taste slightly sweet and grain-like. It would quench thirst and provide some calories. The child would not feel any different after drinking it than they did before. They would not understand it as an intoxicating substance, but simply as a normal drink. As young people reached adolescence and adulthood, they would begin drinking stronger ale and wine. Their first experiences with genuine intoxication might occur at this stage of life. A young person getting drunk for the first time would experience all the effects we have discussed, but with the added element of novelty. They might find the sensation exciting and liberating, or they might find it frightening and unpleasant. Their reaction would likely be influenced by the social context and the reactions of those around them. Adults would have the most freedom and opportunity to drink. The pattern of daily moderate drinking combined with occasional heavy drinking at celebrations would characterize most adults' experience with alcohol throughout their lives. As they aged, some might find that they could not tolerate alcohol as well as they once did, experiencing stronger effects from the same amount of drink. Others might develop a tolerance through regular use and find that they needed more alcohol to achieve the same effect. Elderly people in medieval times often continued to drink throughout their lives, though they might reduce their consumption if they found it disagreed with them. For an elderly person suffering from chronic pain or illness, wine or ale might provide some comfort and relief. The experience of drinking in old age would be colored by a lifetime of memories associated with drinking and by an awareness of mortality. Let us turn now to the experience of pregnancy and childbirth in relation to alcohol. Pregnant women in medieval times typically continued to drink ale throughout their pregnancy. as it was part of the normal diet, its dangers were not understood. However, they might be advised to avoid wine or strong drink, based on the belief that the heat of the wine could harm the developing child. The experience of a pregnant woman drinking ale would be much the same as her usual experience of drinking. She would not notice any immediate effects on the pregnancy. The potential harm to the developing fetus from alcohol exposure was not recognized in medieval times, and women had no reason to abstain from their normal ale consumption. During childbirth, women in labor might be given wine or other alcoholic drinks to ease pain and provide strength. The experience would be of some pain relief and a sense of warmth and courage from the wine, though the pain of labor would still be intense. After birth, women in labor might be given wine or other alcoholic drinks to ease pain and provide strength. The experience would be of some pain relief and a sense of warmth and courage from the wine, though the pain of labor would still be intense. After birth, women in the lying-in period might be given special foods and drinks, including wine, ale, and spiced drinks to help them recover their strength. The social aspect of drinking during the lying-in period deserves mention. Female friends and relatives would visit the new mother, and drinking together was part of this social ritual. The experience would combine the joy of a new birth with the comfort of female companionship and the celebratory drinking. This tradition of the lying-in celebrations, called groaning parties or gossiping parties in some places, was an important social institution. Let us consider the experience of monks engaged in the work of brewing. Monasteries were major producers of ale and beer, and some monks would be assigned to work in the brewery. The work was hot, repetitive, and physically demanding. The monk would spend hours tending fires, lifting heavy sacks of grain, stirring large vats of mash, and cleaning equipment. The smell of the brewery would be overwhelming, a mixture of cooking grain, yeast, and fermentation. The air would be humid and warm. The monk would likely sample the ale at various stages of the brewing process to check its quality. By the end of a day working in the brewery, the monk would have consumed a fair amount of ale through these tastings, though not usually enough to cause intoxication. The experience of this work would be tedious and tiring, but the monk might take satisfaction in knowing that he was producing something necessary for the monastery community. The repetitive nature of the work might become meditative, allowing the monk to pray or reflect while his hands performed the familiar tasks. The mild buzz from the ale tastings might make the work slightly more pleasant. Some monasteries became known for producing exceptional ale or beer, and the monks responsible might take pride in their craft. They might experiment with different ingredients or techniques, trying to improve the quality of their product. The experience of tasting a new batch and finding it superior to previous attempts would bring satisfaction and a sense of accomplishment. Let us explore the relationship between weather and drinking patterns in more detail. In very hot weather, people would drink more to replace fluids lost through sweating. However, they might dilute their ale with water to make it more refreshing and less intoxicating. The experience of drinking diluted ale on a hot day would be of relief and refreshment with only minimal intoxication. In cold weather, people would seek out warming drinks. Spiced wine served hot, similar to modern mulled wine, would be consumed to drive out cold and warm the body. The experience would be of heat spreading from the stomach through the body, combined with the pleasant aroma of spices. The alcohol would enhance the warming sensation and might make the cold seem more bearable. During rainy periods when outdoor work was difficult or impossible, people might spend more time in taverns. The experience would be of escaping the cold and wet into a warm, dry interior where companionship and drink were available. The drinking might be more social and prolonged than usual, as people waited for the rain to stop and had time to fill. During harvest time, when work was urgent and the weather critical, drinking patterns would be influenced by the need to complete the harvest quickly. Workers might drink more than usual to sustain them through long days of hard labor, but they would also need to remain functional and capable of work. The peak experience would be of using alcohol as fuel and reward simultaneously, drinking enough to feel encouraged and energized, but not so much as to become unable to work. Let us now consider the experience of travel and drinking in medieval times. Travelers on the roads would need to stop at taverns and inns for food, drink, and shelter. The quality of these establishments varied greatly. Some were comfortable and well-maintained, offering good ale or wine and decent food. Others were rough and dirty, with poor quality drink and questionable food. The experience of drinking at an unfamiliar inn would involve some uncertainty and wariness. The traveler would not know whether the ale was good or bad until they tasted it. They would need to be cautious about drinking too much in an unfamiliar place surrounded by strangers, as they might be vulnerable to theft or violence. However, the social atmosphere of the inn would also provide opportunities to exchange news and stories with other travelers, and drinking would facilitate these social interactions. Long-distance travelers, such as merchants or pilgrims, would develop knowledge of which inns and taverns along their route offered the best drink and hospitality. The experience of arriving at a favored inn after a long day's travel would be one of relief and pleasant anticipation. The familiar face of the innkeeper, the known quality of the ale, and the comfortable surroundings would all contribute to the experience of drinking there. Sailors and bulls traveling by boat would have different drinking experiences. On ships, water stored in barrels would quickly become stale and undrinkable. Ale or beer was therefore carried for drinking, though it too would eventually spoil. The experience of drinking stale ale on a long voyage would be unpleasant, but it would be preferable to drinking the foul water. Fresh ale or wine consumed upon reaching port would be especially welcome after days or weeks of drinking spoiled beverages. Let us examine the seasonal brewing calendar in more detail. Spring was an important brewing season, as the weather was warm enough for fermentation to proceed reliably, but not so hot that the ale would spoil quickly. Brewers would produce large quantities of ale in the spring to last through the early summer. The experience of drinking fresh spring ale would be of crisp, clean flavors and good quality. Summer brewing was more difficult because of the heat. Ale brewed in summer would spoil quickly and might develop off flavors. Brewers might produce smaller batches more frequently, or might focus on brewing very weak ale that would be consumed quickly before it could spoil. The experience of summer ale might be of lower quality and less consistent flavor than spring ale. Autumn, after the harvest, was another major brewing season. Barley and other grains were freshly harvested and could be malted and brewed. Autumn ales would be consumed through the winter months. Brewers might make stronger ales in autumn, as the cooler weather would allow them to keep longer without spoiling. The experience of autumn ale would be of richer, more robust flavors. Winter was not an ideal brewing time in areas where temperatures fell below freezing, as the cold could prevent or slow fermentation. However, the cool temperatures were excellent for storing ale. Winter drinking would rely on ale brewed in autumn and valid by late winter. Supplies might be running low and quality might be declining. The experience of late winter ale might be of a drink past its prime, but still preferable to water. Let us consider the experience of different social classes in their drinking. The nobility and wealthy merchants had access to the finest wines from across Europe and beyond. Their daily drinking would include wine rather than ale, and at feasts, they would serve multiple types of wine along with spiced wine preparations like hippocras. The experience would be one of variety and quality. For a wealthy person, drinking was not just about the beverage itself, but about display and status. Serving rare or expensive wines to guests demonstrated wealth and sophistication. Drinking from ornate goblets made of precious metals or fine glass, rather than from wooden or pottery cups, was another status marker. The experience of drinking expensive wine from a beautiful goblet in the company of other wealthy people would reinforce one's social position. The middle ranks of society, including prosperous craftsmen, merchants, and farmers, would have access to decent quality ale and occasional wine. Their drinking would be comfortable and adequate, but not luxurious. They might brew their own ale or purchase it from local brewers. The experience would be of solid, everyday drinking without particular distinction. The poor would drink the cheapest and often lowest quality ale. It might be thin and weak, barely alcoholic. It might be poorly brewed and unpleasant tasting. However, even this poor quality ale was better than unsafe water. The experience would be of making do with what was available, finding small pleasures where they could, and accepting that better quality drink was beyond their means. Let us now discuss the relationship between religions and fasting in more detail as it relates to drinking. During Lent and other fasting periods, Christians were expected to abstain from meat and veg, sometimes from other foods. However, drink was generally not prohibited. In fact, there was a saying that liquid does not break a fast, and people might consume substantial quantities of ale or beer during fasting periods to compensate for reduced food intake. Some monasteries brewed special strong beer for consumption during Lent. This beer, higher in alcohol and calories than regular beer, would help sustain the monks through the fasting period. The experience of drinking this strong beer while fasting would be of warmth, nourishment, and a mild buzz that might help make the fast more bearable. Some monks might become quite intoxicated on this strong beer, which led to some criticism and eventual reforms. The experience of drinking during a religious fast, would have a particular quality. The person would be conscious of their sacrifice and religious devotion. The drink would take on increased importance as one of the few pleasures still permitted. There might be a sense of finding loopholes in the fasting rules, which could produce feelings ranging from satisfaction at being clever to guilt at violating the spirit if not the letter of the fast. Breaking a fast after Easter or another fasting period would be celebrated with feasting and drinking. The experience of drinking wine or strong ale after weeks of fasting would be especially potent. The person's tolerance might be reduced by the period of reduced food intake, making the alcohol hit harder. The psychological relief of the fast being over would combine with the physical effects of the alcohol to produce a particularly joyful and celebratory experience. Let us consider the experience of seasonal festivals in more detail. Christmas was a major occasion for drinking and celebration. The 12 days of Christmas, from December 25th to January 6th, were a period of feasting and merrymaking. Special ales and wines would be prepared for Christmas. The wassail bowl, a large bowl of spiced ale or wine, would be passed around for communal drinking. The experience of Christmas drinking would be deeply connected to the religious significance of the holiday and to traditions of hospitality and generosity. Hosts would provide abundant drink to their guests. Employers might give drink to their workers. Lords might provide ale for their tenants. The drinking would strengthen social bonds and express the joy of celebrating Christ's birth. May Day, celebrated on the 1st of May, was another occasion for drinking. This festival had pre-Christian origins, but was integrated into the Christian calendar. Young people would gather to celebrate the return of spring, dancing around maypoles and drinking ale or wine. The experience would be of youthful exuberance, flirtation, and the joy of warmer weather after the long winter. Harvest festivals in late summer or early autumn celebrated the successful gathering of crops. These were times of relief and celebration after the hard work and anxiety of the harvest season. Drinking would be abundant, as there was now fresh grain available for brewing and a sense that the year's survival was assured. The experience would be of earned celebration and community solidarity. Saints' days throughout the year provided additional occasions for drinking. Each parish had a patron saint, and the saint's day would be celebrated with a feast and drinking. Craft guilds also had patron saints, and guild members would celebrate their saint's day together. The experience would combine religious devotion with social celebration and the particular identity of the community or craft group. Let us examine in more detail the process of becoming intoxicated at a typical medieval feast. The guests would arrive in the late afternoon and would be offered wine or ale as they assembled. This initial drinking would be social and moderate as people greeted each other and waited for all the guests to arrive. The conversation would be polite and the atmosphere somewhat formal. Once all the guests had arrived and taken their places at the tables, the feast would begin with a prayer of thanks. The first course of food would be brought out along with more drink. As the guests ate and drank, the atmosphere would gradually relax. The formality of the beginning would give way to more casual conversation and laughter. As additional courses were served and more wine or ale was poured, the effects of the alcohol would accumulate. Voices would get louder. People would become more animated in their gestures and expressions. Jokes and stories would be told with increasing frequency. The line between appropriate and inappropriate behavior would begin to blur. By the middle of the feast, many guests would be noticeably intoxicated. Some would be flushed and sweating. Others would be speaking too loudly or too much. A few might be becoming amorous or aggressive. The servants would continue to bring food and drink, and most guests would continue to consume both, though some might be slowing down or even falling asleep at the table. Toward the end of the feast, as the final courses were served, and the entertainment concluded, the scene would be one of general drunkenness mixed with satiation from food. Some guests would be struggling to stay awake, others would be engaged in intense conversations that might or might not make sense. A few might have already left or been helped to their chambers. The hosts would be managing the chaos as best they could, while also likely being somewhat intoxicated themselves. The next day, the recovery phase would involve much groaning and regret. Guests would wake late with headaches and upset stomachs. They would drink water or weak ale to rehydrate. They would eat simple, bland foods. They would spend the day resting and recovering. And they would vow, as people have done throughout history, never to drink so much again, though they likely would at the next feast. This completes our examination of what getting high was like in medieval times. As we have seen, the medieval experience of altered consciousness was dominated by alcohol in the form of ale and wine, with occasional use of medicinal substances like opium and various herbal preparations. The experience was shaped by social context, religious belief, medical understanding, and economic circumstances. It was at once similar to and different from the modern experience of intoxication, familiar in its basic effects but foreign in its cultural meaning and context. The medieval world was one where drinking was woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that might seem strange to us today. From the morning cup of ale with breakfast to the evening drinks before bed, alcohol was a constant presence. Yet for most people, it produced not dramatic intoxication, but rather a subtle background hum of mild effects that were simply part of normal consciousness. When more dramatic alterations occurred, whether from heavy drinking at feasts or from medicinal use of opium or other substances, they were understood through frameworks of religion, humoral medicine, and social custom that gave them meanings quite different from modern understanding. The drunk person at a feast was not experiencing a neurochemical cascade of neurotransmitter changes, but rather an imbalance of hot and moist humors. The person taking opium for pain was not activating their opioid receptors, but rather receiving a divine gift of relief through the natural properties God had placed in the poppy. These different frameworks of understanding shaped the subjective experience in ways we can only partially reconstruct. What did it feel like to get drunk while believing that your soul was imperiled by the sin of gluttony? How did opium dreams differ when interpreted as visions rather than hallucinations? We can describe the physical effects and the social contexts, but the inner experience remains somewhat mysterious, separated from us by centuries of changing consciousness and belief. And now, dear listener, we hope this thorough and detailed examination has proven sufficiently boring to help you drift off to sleep. May your dreams be peaceful and free from the excesses of medieval revelry. Good night.